Hello, BBC. This is Chester WIlmot speaking from Germany. Last Sunday, a train steamed out of Brunswick station. On board it, there were 4,500 prisoners and foreign workers, Frenchmen, Belgians, Russians, Poles, and even Germans. Men and women who had been working as Nazi slaves in the Hermann Goering steelworks near Brunswick. As the Allies drew near, the Germans tried to clear away their human loot, even though most of these 4,500 were starved and sick. Their SS guards told them that they were being taken to another camp, where they were to be gassed and cremated. But they didn't reach that camp. Yesterday in the town of Celle, a Frenchman who was on that train told me what happened to them. On Sunday evening, he said, the train stopped in the station yard at Celle while the engine filled up with water and coal. Our carriages were left standing between an ammunition train and a petrol train, and we hadn't been there long when some Allied bombers came over. When we heard them coming, he said, we tried to get out of the train, but as we jumped down onto the tracks, the SS guards opened fire on us with machine guns. Then the bombs began to fall and they hit the train. The ammunition and the petrol began to explode. Many must have been killed, but those who survived tried to get away from the fire and the explosions. Some of us, he said, reached shelter, but most of the rest were shot down by the SS guards. After it was all over, there were only 200 left out of the 4,500, and we 200 were rounded up by the SS and herded into a stable, a filthy stable, and there we lay on the straw that barely covered the manure underneath. Many of us, he added, were wounded or burnt, but they left us there for 4 days without medical attention, food or water. We were rescued only when the British came. Yesterday, in Celle, I saw most of the 200 survivors. I was taken round a hospital by a British doctor and a captain who were the first to find them. The men I saw were almost skeletons, and the doctor said that he had never seen men in such pitiable condition. They'd been starved for years, until their legs were no thicker than a man's wrist and their bodies were mere skin and bone. They must have been almost as starved as this when they boarded that train, and yet only the day before that, most of them had been slaves in a German factory. They told us how the Nazis had put German criminals in with them to act as spies, and how these criminals had been given the privilege of supervising their work and of beating them on the slightest provocation. One Frenchman, a man who had been captured as a member of the Maquis, told me that when he came he couldn't understand German, but when he didn't obey orders, shouted at him in German, he had been beaten. He and many others said that this was typical. They told us how they'd been forced to work on starvation rations and had been paid 1 mark a week, and a mark is worth 6pence. All we could buy with that, said one Frenchman, was food that we give only to pigs. When these men were rescued by our troops, they were too weak to move. They had to be carried on stretchers to German hospitals in the town. But our troops saw to it that these stretchers were carried by German civilians and were carried through the streets so that the German people could see what their fellow Germans had done. Yesterday afternoon, the doctor and the captain who had rescued them were continuing this German education. With them, I visited one of the hospitals. There were 4 Germans with us too. One, the local schoolmaster, who'd been an ardent Nazi. Another, a man you might call a German country squire, who spoke perfect English. And 2 others, a man and his daughter, who were members of the old Junkers von Moltke family. Their reactions were interesting. The little Nazi schoolmaster tried to plead justification. These men were criminals, he said. We didn't treat all our foreign workers like this. Most of them were glad to come. Yes, said the squire, and those who worked on our farms were well treated and had plenty to eat. The German people looked after the foreign workers. It is only the SS who have done this kind of thing. The von Moltkes also blamed the SS and the party, but they could see no connection between this and the support their military class had given to the Nazis. Even confronted with this evidence, they could not see or admit Germany's guilt.